Everything is economics. I was just thinking about that title, and I hate to be awkward, but I disagree. I do think that obviously it depends what you're talking about, but in the world that I deal with, which is international affairs, international relations, economics obviously is incredibly important, but it's not the only thing. There's a lot of politics as well, and it's what I often write about, and what I'd like to talk about today, is the interaction between economics and politics, and how that tends to determine the outcome. And let me start by giving you a very practical example of what I'm talking about. Think about the crisis that's threatening to engulf us all, the euro crisis. Of course, it's in a very important ways. It's at its core is economics. Can Greece pay its debts? How can we restructure the banks and all of that? But I don't think you can understand how we got here or how we're going to get out of it without looking at the political side as well. Because if you've got a group of economists together to discuss the Greek crisis, I'm sure they could come up with some way out of it. But the question is it politically feasible? Can you, to put it bluntly, persuade the Dutch and the Germans to write a large check for Greece? That's a political question. And it's the interaction between politics and economics on a much broader global scale and over a period of history really from 1978 to the present day, which is what I'd like to talk to you about today. I think the concept I'd like to start with is globalization, which again sounds above all, or maybe exclusively, an economic concept. We do think about it in terms of trade and investment, and perhaps a little bit in cultural terms, the spread of icons like McDonald's or Nike around the world. But I always think that it's been also a political phenomenon, that if you want to understand the 30 years of politics from 78 to 2008, globalization was the central political event. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that it was the kind of provided the core of the relationship between the world's major powers. It provided a system that they could all buy into, certain common assumptions that they could all buy into. So yesterday evening, you honored Victor Halberstadt, who is a man I occasionally come across at the World Economic Forum. And the World Economic Forum was an interesting example of what I call the globalization consensus, because you would go to this event on a Swiss mountain valley every year, and you'd have very, very different political systems represented there. You'd have communist China, you'd have the United States, you'd have the European Union, India, countries as different as they could be, and yet there were certain ideas that the leaders all seemed to buy into, which were, we must have more trade, we must have more investment, we must encourage international cooperation organized around business. They were talking to the same investment bankers, the same businessmen, and it was very striking that although these countries were organized on very, very different lines politically, culturally very differently, they were politically bought into some common assumptions about how the world should operate. And that really had built up over the course of 30 years. So if you'll tolerate me, I'd like to go back a little bit in history now and explain how this globalization consensus built up, and then what I think happened to it in 2008 and what the political consequences are. It all began, I think, in China in 78 with the coming of Deng Xiaoping, the famous plenum, I think it was the 5th plenum of the Chinese Communist Party, where China turns its back on Maoism and begins a series of economic reforms that open itself up to the West and that create what we now know as this incredible economic miracle, which will probably see China as the world's largest economy by the end of the decade. But that event in China was just the beginning of what I call an age of transformation from 1978 to 1991. An age of transformation because that was a period in which really all the world's major powers embrace capitalism and embrace globalization. So you have China in 78, but then in 1979 in my own country, Margaret Thatcher comes to power. In 1980, Reagan comes to power in the US. Now, of course, they were already capitalist countries, but these were two political leaders who believed very firmly in the free enterprise system, who did certain things which gave a big kick to global capitalism, cutting taxes in the US, in Britain getting rid of exchange controls, which was what helped to drive the the boom in the City of London. Then in 1982, you have the Latin American debt crisis. And that really transforms Latin America over the course of a decade. You have the downfall of military regimes really across the continent, military regimes that had been associated with certain forms of inward-looking economics. And you have a new class of democratic technocrats who come in and try and plug Latin America into the global economy. Then in the European Union itself, you also get a kind of mini-globalization, the Single European Act, breaking down of trade and investment barriers, an economic act, but with profound political implications because it draws the countries together. Then, of course, the event that really was the most dramatic event of this age of transformation, 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the half of Europe that had been walled off from capitalism and from the democratic system then joins it. And then 1991, a year that doesn't quite resonate as much as 1989, but seems to me may end up being even as significant in the great scheme of things, because 1991 was the year that India, which is the last major power that is still really not joining in with globalization, changes the economic policies on which it's really based its approach to the world since independence, which have been very inward-looking, autarkic. India has a massive economic crisis in 91. Sounds like another crisis going on there, but India has a big economic crisis in 91, and they look around the world and they say, well, look, we can see what's been happening in China, we can see what's been happening in Southeast Asia. We too should adopt outward-looking economic policies which attempt to plug into the globalization system. So in a very short space of time, 13 years, you move from a world where the capitalist, developed world is really a relatively small group of countries, Western Europe, the US, and Japan, to a world in which there is a globalized economy in which all the world's major powers are participating. Then for roughly 20 years, 91 to 2008, there's what I call an age of optimism in which this globalization consensus holds. And for all their differences, the major powers are all plugged into it. And for different reasons, they all have reason to feel optimistic and happy about the world system and how it's operating for them. Take the United States. This is what came to be known as their unipolar moment, because of course the Soviet Union is no more, the US is the sole superpower. America, which had been worrying about its economy and its position vis-a-vis Japan, has a resurgence of economic confidence because under Clinton the budget deficit comes under control for a while, and there's also this incredible boom in Silicon Valley. Steve Jobs, I see, has died today. He was one of the iconic figures of that age which restored the confidence in American business and its ability to lead the world. So for political and economic reasons, America is confident. And also, I think vitally, there's an ideological edge to that confidence. After the Cold War, the Americans feel, okay, we now know, as Fukuyama put it, there's the end of history, that our system works, and countries that want to succeed around the world will have to embrace liberal capitalism and in essence embrace democracy. And that's a very important way of thinking because it allows America to deal with what might in other circumstances seem a rather threatening development, which is the rise of China. Normally, big established powers don't like the idea of new rising powers, but the Americans look at China and they say, well, look, they're opening up to capitalism. In time, that will lead to democratization of the system. And you can see in very different presidents, Bush and Clinton, they both say similar sorts of things. George W. Bush, when China joins the World Trade Organization, says, trade freely with China and time is on our side. So the Americans are, perhaps in historical perspective, slightly too relaxed about the rise of China. Briefly, this is also an age of optimism in other parts of the world. In China itself, the economy is doubling in size every 7 to 8 years. Why wouldn't they feel positive about the globalization system that's allowing them to do that? There's a resurgence of confidence in India, a feeling that India, which had been apparently condemned to relative poverty or absolute poverty in many cases, can also compete and can be a major power, the rise of the Indian IT industry and all of that. Let us not forget this was also an era of optimism in the European Union. This was a period where the EU has a massive expansion, moves from 12 to 27 nations, launches the single currency, which is an optimistic act, perhaps a little too optimistic as we now discover. But there's a sense too, I lived and worked in Brussels at the time, there was much talk of a European model that could be rolled out across the world, that Europe still had things, important things, to tell the world. So this was the age of optimism that prevailed in the years before the financial crisis of 2008. And it should be remembered that 2007 was one of the fastest years of global economic growth ever experienced around the world. I think Steve Forbes, the American entrepreneur, said this is the richest year in world history, an announcement made at Davos. But then, of course, we all know what happened. There is this massive financial crisis. And in the immediate aftermath of the crisis, everybody thinks primarily, naturally enough, about economics. They think about their jobs, about collapsing banks and so on. But I think it's become apparent that it's also very much changed the way in which states relate to each other. And, in a book, as in the kind of book I've just written, you have to try and summarize things in a few pithy sentences. If I had to summarize it, the reason I called it zero-sum world is because I believe that in this age of optimism before 2008, the world did seem very win-win. It was a win for the US, it was a win for China, that both sets of leaders could plausibly say to their peoples, look, this system is working well for our countries, we can stick with it. I think in the aftermath of 2008, the world, at least, and politics, looks more zero-sum in international relations. So to give you a practical example, the central relationship, I think, that will define international politics over the next 20, 50 years will be the relationship between China and the United States. That's going to be the dominant relationship in international relations. Now, I think America is moving from a period where it felt that, a richer, stronger China was something that America could live with, it would lead to a more prosperous, stronger America, to at least asking the question, well, maybe, does a richer, stronger China actually mean a relatively poorer, relatively weaker United States? Now, I don't want to actually endorse zero-sum logic. I think it's very complicated, and I think it's a dangerous path once you go down that path, because it leads to international conflict. So what I'm doing is describing the way I think politics is going, rather than saying, and that's a good thing too, it's about time the Americans woke up. I think actually it's in all sides' interest to maintain a positive relationship between these two, the sole superpower, the US, and the emerging superpower, China. But I think if you look at the way things are going, only this week, the Senate passed a protectionist trade bill allowing the US to impose tariffs on Chinese goods. Now, Obama has yet to sign it. In fact, it's yet to go through the House. It may never see the light of day, but I think it's a sign of the way the debate in America has changed. There's a sense that the rise of China is now a threat to the US, and perhaps the US should take preventative action. And the economics understandable, given that America now has unemployment of 9%, 17% if you include discouraged workers, those who've stopped even looking for work, that they have this massive budget deficit, and so on. And of course, we in Europe are not immune to this fear of the BRICS, of the rising powers, the sense of, well, what are our young people going to do? Do we perhaps have to face a real drop in living standards? Of course, is the euro crisis in some way related to our inability to compete with rising powers, not just China, but India, Brazil, and so on? So in our attitude to the world, we can see a kind of rise of zero-sum logic. Just a last word on China-US before I move to Europe. The economics are at the core of it, but economics aren't everything. There's also a strategic and diplomatic side to this face-off between America and China. Emerging face-off, because of course they still meet and have discussions which can appear quite friendly at times. But on the strategic side, I think a really big question to watch is that America is still the world's dominant military power, enormously so. But even in the Pacific, even in China's own backyard, and yet China's developing a whole set of new weapons which threaten the basis of American power in the Pacific, missiles that can hit American aircraft carriers or American air bases. Now, I don't think those missiles will ever be used in anger. I think it's too dangerous in a nuclear age. But it does affect the way the two powers think about each other. And it affects the way that the powers in between think about it. So if you're Japan or if you're Australia, you're in a very strange situation now because your major strategic relationship is with the United States. They're the guarantors of your security, but your major economic relationship is now with China. Because for India, for Australia, South Korea, Japan, all of them big American allies, their economies are increasingly centered around China, and that's an emerging point of tension. Finally, diplomatically, a lot of big international issues now come down to sort of face-off between America and China. If you're going to get a trade deal, you have to have a US-Chinese agreement. If you're going to get a climate change deal, you have to have a US-Chinese agreement. And yet, they're finding it very, very hard to strike these deals, which is why you get a lot of these big multilateral organizations, whether it's the climate change talks in Copenhagen or the World Trade talks, stuck. I've spoken about US-China, but this rise of zero-sum logic is something that I think you can see in other areas. Let's come closer to home, the European Union. Now, I think the European Union was more or less a sort of globalization in miniature. What we did was to use the win-win logic of economics, of better economic relations, to create a more positive political dynamic between the countries that, of course, had historically been at war with each other. And that was always the founding idea of the European Union, of Monnet and Schuman and so on. It was, their goal was political, but their means were economic. So they would start with a coal and steel community, they would build up, they'd have a single market, eventually you would have a single currency. And the idea was, look, if we integrate ourselves economically, if we do more things together, if we become more prosperous together, that will have a positive political spin-off. And for many, many years, that worked very well, really, for the 50 years from the foundation of this coal and steel community to more or less where we are now. But I think that what we've seen is that in an atmosphere of economic crisis, that logic goes into reverse. So now the fact that we are so economically enmeshed is actually worsening the political atmosphere and creating a sense that things are zero-sum, because if you're sitting in a creditor country, a Netherlands or a Germany, you think, well, you know, why should I write this check for Greece? That is an example of how economic integration with the rest of Europe is actually making me worse off, not better off. And then that, in turn, embitters the politics, so that I was very struck when I was in Athens recently. The demonstrators there, some of them anyway, are carrying EU flags with a swastika in the middle of it. A fairly, you know, extreme political statement, and almost the reverse, well, absolutely the reverse of what the European Union was meant to be about. And I think the big challenge for the EU now is not just to find an economic and financial way out of the mess that we're in, but also to find a way that preserves the internal political balance of the countries that are having to make these decisions, whether it's Greece having to force through austerity, or the Netherlands and Germany having to persuade their people to do things they really don't want to do. And then within that then comes back to the relationship between the states of Europe, which was, after all, what the EU was founded all those years ago to regulate. Because if you get a radical, you know, the big calculation that leaders have to make is, if they push their peoples too far, do they radicalize their politics in such a way that they create nationalist forces which then serve to break up the European Union or really seriously embitter relations between European states? Finally, this question of global governance is, I think, an important one. It sounds a kind of slightly dead, depressing phrase, but I think one of the consequences of globalization was that we became aware that there's a whole group of big political issues out there, political and economic issues, that no state, not even the United States, not even China, can deal with on its own. Whether it's climate change or terrorism or the threat of failed states, these are by their nature international problems which have to be dealt with in some form of international agreement. The trouble is that in the post-crisis economic era, it's become that much harder to find a way to deal with these issues. And here I think the European crisis is once again relevant, because I think the Europeans felt for some time, you know, actually world, if you want a model of how to do international cooperation, look at the European Union. You know, we have far more intense interstate relationships and ways of regulating it, sets of laws, bureaucracies, etc. And I think that there was a sense that maybe the G20 was a kind of global EU in embryo. Of course it wasn't when it started. It's a much more informal, interstate thing. But if you were going to get the G20 going, that perhaps in time it would come to seem like a sort of global European Union, where you would have a secretariat, you would have policies that they worked on, which would be put before leaders, and that is how you would eventually crack problems like climate change and so on. And therefore, I think it's of global significance that the discrediting, as it now seems, of the European model discredits one of the most hopeful developments in international politics, which was this effort to get world leaders together to solve problems that threaten us all, whether it is climate change or nuclear proliferation or whatever. So that is a fairly gloomy note to end on. Later today, I will be paired, I think, in a discussion with my most optimistic friend, who's Matt Ridley, who will tell you that everything's going to be fine, and I will leave that discussion to later. And I'm very glad there's somebody who will tell you that. But I think it's partly because Matt deals with a much longer time horizon. He thinks in centuries, whereas I'm only allowed to think in decades. But I would like to end with something that's at least possibly optimistic, because one of the traps of writing a book about international politics is that publishers still think in centuries, actually. So you give them the manuscript and then they kind of sit on it for a year or two, and there's this terror that some huge development will happen which will make your book look silly before it even comes out. And in my case, the event that happened the week the book came out in the United States was the Arab Spring. So I then had to think, well, how does this fit in with my description of the world? And actually, it sounds like a bit of a cop-out, but we don't yet know, because I think the events of the Arab Spring could go in one of two directions. They could either reinforce what I call the narrative of the age of optimism, the period before 2008, when the world did seem to be converging around certain universal ideas, democracy, free markets, and so on. And I think, obviously, those ideas were powerful ideas in what happened in Egypt, what's happened in Libya. And if these countries, eventually come to a more stable, freer system, that will reinforce, if you like, the Fukuyama end of history theory, that in the end there is no real alternative to liberal democracy, that countries are going to cohere with some bumps around that system. If, on the other hand, things go wrong, inverted commas, that these countries don't stabilize, that they fall into Iraqi-style civil war, you get new forms of dictatorship, radicalism, failed states, all possibilities, then I think you're looking at a more dark scenario, obviously, but one that sort of fits more into the logic of zero-sum, where the development in one part of the world, in the Arab world, rather than being a positive, a plus for Europe, begins to look like something, yet another problem on our plate, a destabilization of our immediate neighborhood. But that's perhaps something that we can discuss in the question and answer. I think I've more than over-fulfilled my 20 minutes, so I'll stop now and we can perhaps do some questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Gideon.